We're doing double duty today, so if it goes wrong, you can blame Jake. This week, we're talking about the years 1949 to 1979. I think there's one more. There we go. All right. Hey, I can't sit. No, I'm just joking. We want to talk about something we didn't touch upon last time, but he sort of carried across. We had a pastor here for 23 years. His name was Reverend A.D. Parrish. He also served at that time as the pastor of Corinth Baptist Church and Antioch Baptist Church. It was not uncommon at the time for pastors to serve several churches. Services weren't always held on Sunday morning, and when you had a pastor that was serving three churches, sometimes the pastors would serve several, and you'd have odd times for services. We'll talk a little bit more about Preacher Parrish as we go down the line. But we want to make sure that we mention him because he was an important part of this church and a beloved man for many years. We talked about the sanctuary and the education building that was being constructed last time. During the 1950s, however, one of the focuses of the church was on Sunday school attendance. Sunday school attendance reached its highest levels ever, and the church stressed the importance of Christian education. 1951 was the absolute highest total enrollment. We had 448 people enrolled in Sunday school. Even in 1955, which was 3 or 4 years later, the average attendance for Sunday school was 264 people. That's a lot of people in Sunday school. It's rare today that we even have that many in class. Perfect attendance was a big deal. Perfect attendance pins were awarded each year. Miss Carolyn Pace has got some. We're going to have show those in the film that we do on Homecoming Day. And if anybody else has any of those, we'd love to have some. Perfect attendance was awarded with a pin, and every year after that you had perfect attendance, you added an additional bar to the pin. So let me give you an example of some of the people that we had perfect attendance. Johnny Green Johnson had 11 years. Her sister Joyce Green Harris, 22 years of perfect attendance at Sunday school. Laban Green, 21 years. His wife Janie and daughter Brenda, 19 years, and Delma Flowers, 14 years. That's a lot of perfect Sunday school attendance. One of the major firsts for White Oak was our first female deacon, Miss Mildred Price. Now, it's interesting, you talk about the fact that we're a very rural church. It's odd now that there's an awful lot of Baptist churches that don't have female deacons, don't have females in any officers now. So in the 1950s, for White Oak to have a female deacon, in fact, 2 female deacons, Miss Mildred Price was the first, and one of the first in Johnson County, if not the first. We just don't have a way of verifying that. Miss Moselle Blinson was also a deacon right after her. Now, there's some other funny stories about Miss Moselle Blinson. I'm going to tell you one, and then Jake's going to talk a little bit more. But Miss Carolyn was telling us in our interviews, one of the ways that we got Sunday school and church attendance up in the 50s was if you were in Miss Moselle's class across the street at the school, she would ask you on Monday morning if you had been to Sunday school and church the day before. And by about the 6th week of school, you didn't want to say no. So she was very important in raising our church and Sunday school attendance. Maybe now we have a school right down the road, we can work on that some. Jake, you want to talk a little bit more about Miss Moselle?
Yeah, Miss Moselle was a character. She didn't teach me, and I'm glad she didn't because I wouldn't have no hair right now. She would take the students out of her classroom and lead them to the principal's office by the hair of the head and then open the door and slam them. That's the truth. I saw it. I was over, but she didn't teach me, but she was one of my dearest friends. Who's going to lift up the stool? This is the piano stool that she sat on all through these 2 churches, the 1910 church and this church. And we did salvage it and put it up in the archives room, and dust and all jammed. But anyway, this was the stool, and she was a very good music teacher. One of the things about her that she did was if we were draggy in the morning singing, she would bounce right up on that at the piano and stand up and said, "If you can't do no better than that, go home." This scared the preacher to death. He thought the church was on empty.
There's it.
So I think that's pretty good on her. We appreciate Moselle, and her husband was the one that managed this building. He looked after the building himself, and the church paid a lady and Mrs. Nod in Wendell to run his store while he was out here. We didn't have a contractor. This building was built without a contractor, without too much plans. We just built it. But Mr. Coy was actually our leader. And then after Mr. Coy was Clinton Boyd looked after the building. And then he did a wonderful job. And then Jimmy Knox had about 10 or 12 years. And then next, who you know inherited it, I've had about 15. But this church has supported the Building and Grounds Committee and put the money there, so that's why we have a nice building. So all of you, pat yourselves on the back for that.
I lost my microphone, so I'm just going to have to talk loud, and I'm good at that, so that's all right. By the way, you better sing loud today. Dara said in the spirit of Miss Mosdale, if we're not singing loud, then she's going to stop. With the education building complete in the early 1950s, church services were held right down here where the hallway is and the choir room and those Sunday school rooms at this end of the building. All that was open, as you can see right here. Imagine we have an elevator back there now, but that was the sanctuary for almost 10 years. Do you know that we had as many as 350 people crammed in that room for Sunday school? It carries obviously across the hall there, and there are more pews that you can't see in that photograph. That was the church sanctuary while this building was being built. Now, funny thing about it was that also served not just as a sanctuary, but the site of funerals and weddings. Now, there's a real skinny dude got married over there. You see him back over there on the right, just under the archway. That was 1952, Jake?
Yep.
Just yesterday. Just yesterday.
Miss Mosdale's on the far right with the corsage on.
Miss Mosdale was part of everything in the church there for a long time. She played the piano for every ceremony that was held here. Jake, anything else you want to talk about that service over there?
Well, it was my wedding day. And I went to Florida on my honeymoon, and I had, I think, maybe $200. I don't know how we stayed down there. But anyway, that was a different day than now. Go ahead.
All this time now, construction on the sanctuary was going on because the old sanctuary was now down, and they were working on the church here. Okay, the first thing that went up that was recognizable was the steeple. When the steeple was up in 1957, 2 years before the church was dedicated, the bell was put up there. That bell that you heard ring this morning is a bell from the 1910 church. We have lots of things that have been salvaged from that old church, including this lectern right here. That was used as well. By the end of the 1950s, White Oak Sanctuary was well on its way to being complete. A lot of the work was done by church members, and contributions came from all directions. Jake's going to tell you about one of those right now.
Most of the timber in this church was got from our, pardon me, most of the timber from this church came from our farms in the local area. We would cut it, and Mr. Jimmy Flowers, Percy Flowers, his brother, lived up the 42 highway, had a sawmill, and he gave us the use of that sawmill for like a certain week or a certain day, and he provided a man to run it. And most of the timber in this church has come from our local farms, and it was sawed down at Mr. Jimmy Flowers. And I well remember it because I didn't know what I was doing. I was jumping the logs and broke my ankle. But we need to take our hats off to some of these people. It's hard to call names without calling everybody. I've already thanked you for your contribution. But Mr. Jimmy Flowers was gracious to do that. We would have never got it built because we couldn't afford the timber. All the timber in the back is mostly oak. And there's most of the floors are oak. And Dowers has been refinished, and the pastor stud. So you need to stop and look at those too. They're just beautiful floors. And you might not know it, but under this carpet is hardwood floors. And you know how you women are now. You want to rip up the carpet and go back to it. But don't start it here.
Every piece of that timber that you walk on every day underneath this carpet came from that sawmill. It was sawed by Mr. Flowers' man and members of the church to put it together.
His wife was Gladys, and she was very active in the church. Very.
So in 1910, the church is just about to move into a new sanctuary. Membership is at an all-time high. The church saw the need for a full-time pastor. So at that point in time, Reverend Parrish, who had been here and been serving 3 churches, was asked if he'd like to become the full-time pastor. He said, I really enjoyed serving multiple churches. I'd like to stay in that role. So one of the things that White Oak did was went out and sought a full-time pastor. That was Reverend James Pulley. He was called in 1959. We didn't have a parsonage at the time, so he and his family lived in this teacherage over here. I don't know how many of you that didn't grow up here don't realize that the building on the other side of the ball field was the teacher dormitory for the school. That's where the teachers lived, where the principal lived, where a lot of people lived, and Reverend Pulley lived in there with his wife and family while they were here because we still didn't have a parsonage at that time. One of the other things that happened in 1960, that same year was 1959, was Carolyn Pace helped organize the Baptist Young Women's Group. So the community is undergoing a transition. Okay, a lot of people are not working on the farm anymore. They're living in the community. They're working part-time on the farm, but working full-time jobs elsewhere, somewhere in Raleigh or somewhere else, because the economy is now shifting. So one of the things that was decided upon was, with the 100th anniversary upcoming, the Harvest Festival had been for 20 more years one of the most important things in the church. But with so many people not working on the farm anymore and that farm life just beginning to start transitioning out, the church decided, let's do away with the Harvest Festival, let's start a new tradition, homecoming. Homecoming had the same things as the Harvest Festival, featuring the most important thing, eating. That's the second time that's come up today, so you know it's important. Dinner on the grounds was a big deal. Now, this picture was taken from 1960, but it started in 1959 as our 100th anniversary. It was the first time homecoming, and dinner on the grounds was held here. The preacher that day was Reverend Pulley. He was our 100th anniversary speaker. One of the things that happened for homecoming was pretty interesting, and Jake's going to tell you a little bit about that as well. See all these pews you're sitting on? There's a fascinating story about that.
On the week, the pews were ordered out of Georgia, and they would come not assembled. And they were supposed to get here about the middle of the week before homecoming, and they didn't. They got here on Saturday, and we panicked. So we worked all Saturday night, all the men in the community, everybody we could drag in, putting these pews together. And the next morning we were sweeping dust out the door, dusting off pews, getting ready for homecoming. And Carlton, in my notes, made a note that we went home, took a shower. No shower. we stayed here and ate, and they furnished us biscuits for breakfast, whatever. But these pews were put in here overnight. And later on we added the red cushions.
Good news is pews got in. Just a few weeks later, November 15th of 1959, this sanctuary was dedicated. Sunshine is right on schedule. I'll put it in order for that, Jake. Now that we had a new home, it's time to get even more exciting things going on. In 1960, the Brotherhood was formed. Almost 50 years ago. 33 members joined the Brotherhood. A year later, we realized the need to provide a home for our pastor. Well, by that point in time, Reverend Pulley was moving on, but we were going to get a new pastor. So they decided to start a parsonage committee in 1961. On April 15th of 1962, the church approved plans for the parsonage. Glenn and Jean Moore owned the land between their house and the church here. They donated that land for the parsonage to be built on. It was built for a cost of $13,750. You can't even buy a decent car for that. Now, by that time, White Oak did have a new pastor. Reverend Guy Futrell and his family were the first ones to live in the parsonage. That was in 1962. So within a few months, the parsonage was decided upon, plans were approved, and it was up and built. The baptistry, we're going to move through pretty quick. The baptistry was completed in May of 1965. It was used for the first time for a baptism of 16 new members. Painting in the baptistry was given by the ladies in the Baton Bible class. One of the most exciting things in the church history was cement sidewalks were added in 1967. And if that's not exciting enough, the church did approve the purchase of a new Wurlitzer organ in 1967. The Benevolence Fund, which we're going to be talking about today, it's already come up. You're going to be donating to that after church. That was begun in 1968. After 6 years of Reverend Futrell being here, Reverend Jack Ray became. Now, those of you that don't know, that's Jack Ray on the far right. That was an RA camping trip to the Outer Banks. There's Jimmy Dykes Barnes. Charles Johnson, and I don't know exactly who all the boys are in there, but that's Reverend Ray on the right side. He did enjoy getting out and taking part with the kids. In the spring of 1970, we had air conditioning installed. Thank goodness for that. August 1971, the Caroline system was given to the church by the Whitley family. In October of 1972, the Johnson Baptist Association met right here at White Oak Baptist Church. In May 1973, pictures of church members and families were taken for the first time for a church pictorial directory. I don't have the 73 book here, but I do have one that was done in 1979, just a couple of years later. So that was what the church looked like back in the 70s. Right around that time, Reverend C.W. Driver came to the church, early 70s. 1973, a native of Archer Lodge, Paul Robertson of Chapel Hill, left in his will a sizable sum of money for White Oak Baptist Church. It was to be paid over a period of 10 years. He had grown up here. In fact, he and his sister Lida and brother Willie were faithful members and attended regularly. They lived in the house where Felton and Jean Thompson lived, right down Covered Bridge Road. Interestingly enough, I'll add one more quick tidbit. That was the post office for Creechville, North Carolina. The house that they lived in. In fact, you can still see a lot of the old, if you ever talk them into letting you up in the attic, there's still a lot of the old post office boxes up there. During the mid-1970s, our first Christmas service was organized by Miss Connie Mulhall. The making of the Christmas was a church-wide project. And in the late 70s, White Oak was blessed to welcome a new pastor, Reverend Irvin Adcock, and his family. They moved into the parsonage, and as fate would have it, he was here when we burned the note for paying off the mortgage on the parsonage. That was 1978. Guys, we took a little extra time. I hope you'll understand that we want to make sure everybody that's here has all these photographs in their memory. We're going to be putting a lot of this stuff in the film, and you'll see it again. But thank you so much for your time. Next week we'll cover 1979 to here, and Jake's got one more thing to add.
One more thing. We've invited all former pastors. We have 4 that are coming back. Guy Future and Nance are coming from Kentucky. C.W. Driver's at Zebulon. He'll be with us, but he won't be able to talk because he has a stroke. But his son will be with him. We have Mr. Irvin Adcock. You saw his picture. He's over at Oxford. He and Patsy will be coming. I guess I get the names right. And then we have one more. Who did I miss?
Jody Griffin.
Jody Griffin. I'm sorry. Jody Griffin is coming. He and Sheila with their 3 children. And the drivers are bringing all their family. So we got to be ready for them and welcome them, and thank you for our time.